monitoring the chat just to make sure that we do cover any questions that are asked during the session. All right, so let's just start right out. Very first question, and this question is going to go to Mike. And Mike, the very first question is, what is your perspective and or definition of what a case study interview is? So basically, in your own words, define a case study interview.
So simply put, it's scenario-based questions, and that lends itself to more problem solving. I think a traditional interview would be more resume-based, which gives you're almost rehashing things and expanding on things actually written in your resume. You know, there's the type of dialogue happens with that. But right now, I think companies are really looking for critical thinking skills, and a scenario-based interview is that type of opportunity to extract how people think through problems. I think also it also gives a sense of a cultural fit, how people work with others in a sense of teamwork. And from my experience, the best part about it was it provided a level of consistency in the organizations that I was hiring for. When you're looking at hundreds of candidates for 50, you know, there's a point where you want to be able to level the playing field.
And Mike, correct me if I'm wrong with the case study interview, but it's not really the result that they're looking for or you're looking for, right? It's the process that you're going through to get to that result. That's the important part to a case study interview. Would you agree with that or not?
100%. You know, the one-word answers don't work, or hey, I know exactly what you need. And you know, like any exam we've taken, you know, there's the credit goes to the work. The credit goes to where things, you know, went a little stray and how do you adjust it, and your level of thinking through problems. You know, for me, you know, a big part of that is somebody to go, well, I don't have that fact, so I'm going to create an assumption in order to help me encourage planning. So without absolutes, I have to base that on what things that I know, things that I think I know, and I'll check those later. But then all of a sudden you start to weave that problem solving into a coherent thought pattern. And here the audience, your interviewer, is now, you know, able to see how your brain works through gaps, because we're always going to have uncertainty and gaps, and it's not meant to paralyze you. It's meant to spur you on to how do I work around that. So a critical piece is watching that process happen.
Excellent. Thank you, Mike. I really appreciate that. And I want to remind students, it's very helpful if you do turn on your cameras, just so that we can see you and see your smiling faces. It's always nice to be talking actually to people instead of images that we see in place of your actual image. So it would be great if you feel comfortable, turn on your cameras, just so the panelists can see you as students too. So now that we know what a case study is, I'm going to throw this next question over to RJ. And RJ, the next question is, what is, if you could just briefly talk about your own personal experience with either giving a case study interview and or participating in a case study interview. So, and it'll be an interesting conversation, I think, to get it from both sides if you're able to do that. Both being able to give a case study and actually being the person who's doing the case study.
Absolutely. So I'll start with from a management consulting perspective, because they're the currency of management consulting interviews. There's usually a behavioral interview and a case study interview. That case study, they'll vary even within a firm. A firm will come on campus and they may give a couple different cases just to see kind of so students can't share necessarily notes on the case studies. It'd be discouraged anyways. But they are really building on what Mike said. It's an ability to peel back the onion on the thinking process. And one thing I actually want to build on that Mike said is the one-word answer. And sometimes you get into delivering a case study and you've read the prompt, you've started to give them the information, and you're asking probing questions to understand, well, where are they starting in this process? How are they, what sort of facts are they saying are material? What facts are immaterial? And where are they starting to organize their information? If you're just getting one word answers, I see it as a chance to get to know the person, because imagine it as a working experience. Let's say we're actually, from a consulting perspective, this is actually a problem that we're trying to solve. Well, where are you going to start in this, and how can I help and build on this with you? So it kind of gives us that sort of team mentality there. And if you're just giving me one word answers, it's difficult to really understand that. Critical for what we were looking for, especially in those interview process, is the structure, process, and logic that you are bringing to that. So how are you taking the complex case, bifurcating it into the smaller pieces? Sometimes you're encouraged to write on a piece of paper or draw it out on a whiteboard, but it's just like showing your work in math. You've got to help me see the logical gaps, because I can then question, is it a break in how you're thinking through a process, or did you just make a mathematical mistake, which is common in these? So there's that, and I do agree, it's not necessarily the answer. I will say, if you're so far off on it and just went down a wrong path and didn't catch a mistake in your logic, that can be a little bit detrimental. We're looking for necessarily end to end and want to have forward and continuity across that thinking process. In my own personal life, from just interviewing processes, so obviously when I was hired into consulting, it was a major component of it. I was hired in my current role. It was a 13-round interview process, and in there was a blend of case studies that were very structured, where truly they're giving you a piece of paper, to less structured one, but with the same intent, which is a situational type analysis, which says like, okay, well, we're facing XYZ, which is usually a real problem that the company is facing, and they wanted to see, how are you going to unpack this? Like, where are you going to start? Because they know necessarily, the interviewer knows necessarily how they might answer that question. They want to see, how does your thinking differ? And this is really a chance to show off your mental chops, and show off like, well, how do you approach this problem, and impress them with more things than, your resume is great, but they want to see, like, how are you going to do beyond the classroom, beyond just the experiences that you had? How are you going to pull that together into a narrative? So a little bit of both.
Oh, I think both of those answers certainly helps to clarify more what the process involved is in a case study interview. And I wanted to key on something that you said, RJ, regarding showing your work or writing on a whiteboard. And for a lot of students, when they go through interviews, they don't have to do that. It's mostly talking back and forth, especially now when we're doing Zoom interviews. So was that weird for you when you had to do that? Like, how do you practice for things like that?
It's a weird, yes, it is a weird skill. The thing I would suggest you do is take a problem, and you can practice cases. There's tons of cases online. What I do is I'll just take a piece of paper and I'll start writing out the known facts across the top, because that's the critical information which I'm going to go back and reference. And then maybe it's a series of hypotheses that I have on how I may solve that. So I'm starting just to structure my thinking, because that's really what it is. So I've got my fact set. I've got hypotheses on how I may solve this, and then maybe I'm starting to write a list of questions that I have out there, and you're trying to have a dialogue. But just, if you think it, write it, and that helps you stay structured, and that makes sure that if you write 100, you don't say 1,000, and if you're quoting a number that they gave you, it's actually accurate. So you want to be taking notes, but you don't need to be. It's also a little bit of a note-taking skill. You don't need to be writing down every exact word that the interviewer is saying, but you want to just stay organized. And so I truly just practice it out on paper. It's easiest for me.
Perfect. Thank you, RJ. So I want to make sure to bring Heather into the conversation. And Heather, can you tell us what the normal process is at your organization?
At Microsoft, yeah.
Yeah, like, do you do case studies at Microsoft?
Yep. Yeah, and I mean, it really depends, obviously, on the role that you're going for, and the team that you're hiring for, because we have 120,000 employees at Microsoft, and a lot of the teams have both technical, very technical people that we're hiring for, and then business focused people. So and across the board, I wouldn't say every time we do case study interviews, but it's probably more the norm now than not. And it could be, as RJ and even Mike, sort of building on what both of them said about like this scenario-based situation. We'll give people that scenario ahead of time, and it can be very open-ended in terms of, hey, you can prepare this ahead of time and you can build out, some slides, or you can sort of walk me through this, but you can get a chance to think about it ahead of time. Sometimes it's in the interview. And again, as RJ said, sort of the going up to the whiteboard and then starting to walk through, what is the problem? How would I start to think about this? But I'd say, 9 times out of 10, when you're in the situation that it's on the spot, you really want to spend, I would recommend, sort of 3/4 of the time netting out the problem, because oftentimes people jump into the solution, and that's what we're trying to sort of check for, which is, are they asking questions? Are they really, again, testing those assumptions? Because we're looking for, again, how do you think? Sort of that values thinking, the systems thinking, because inevitably everybody works on a team these days. There's a ton of collaborations. So you need to think about sort of how your piece is going to fit in with somebody else's piece at the end of the day. So we do it in a few different ways. And I think, again, it's not about being perfect and having the perfect answer. It's about really understanding how you think, the process that you go through, and making sure that you're getting to sort of the crux of the issue as you're working with the interviewers. And they'll try to throw you off. I mean, that's something, but you want to sort of be almost expecting that, like, okay, I'm just gonna, like, you have a gut feeling with stuff oftentimes, and you want to just sort of center in on that and not worry about sort of that seems out of place, and but be ready for some of that, because I think oftentimes that's sort of what we're looking to see what you do in those situations when we're trying to throw you off. But I'd say it really is sort of that, the systems thinking. Are you focusing, for us, are you focusing on the customer? Are you really thinking about it in a very empathetic way? And is there ability to learn along the way? Because I think that's really important, is you may not necessarily have all of the skills, but can you build them pretty quickly?
Wow, you have touched on so many important points in what you just said. And just some of the key things that I managed to pull out, because I would have to write them all down. You hit so many. So not going right to the answer right away, I thought was really good advice. And the question that I'm glad that you touched on was, a topic that you touched on. It's okay for you to ask questions. Is that right?
Absolutely. Oh, absolutely. I'd almost rather that they ask questions, because oftentimes that gives me a window into, again, how do they think, and are they sort of that critical thinking, but they're not just making assumptions based on a scenario that's put in front of them, because there's always, a lot more beyond that is sort of part of the broader picture.
Outstanding. And Mike and RJ, I didn't know if you had anything else you wanted to add on to that as far as the process that your company goes through regarding case studies. Is there anything weird or, anything out of the ordinary that you could tell students that they might prepare for?
Just one other thing I'd add on the asking questions. It's not uncommon for the person delivering the case interview to have certain questions that trigger more information. So asking those questions, you will sometimes get more information. And as an evaluator afterwards, we will talk about, well, did they ask the questions to get this other information? Sometimes some of that information is really critical to solving the case. So definitely ask questions. It's strongly encouraged, and you can get a lot of valuable information.
And for me, we went in, it was always a cold, scenario. So we would just drop them on in the, in the interview just to see how people react to it. And speaking of which, I have to make a confession that I know this is probably not appropriate, but I just wanted to let everybody know that I had surgery this morning, and Jeff's laughing at me. Can you guys believe that? And they found something that I wanted to share. I bleed orange. There it is. I bleed orange. It's true. Okay, so back to the question, and I'm not supposed
Come
to
on,
laugh.
that's terrible. That's so bad.
All right, I'm not supposed to laugh either because I got stitches, so knock it off. All right, back to serious. The one quote that I continue to go back to and see and reference is from Albert Einstein. It says, if I have an hour to solve a problem, I want to spend 55 minutes thinking about the problem and 5 minutes for solutions. So it really is that understanding of how do I navigate through this space, and how do I, the way I look at it from like kind of a military decision-making process was, so what do you know? What are the facts? What do you don't know? What are the gaps? And then, and like I mentioned earlier, there's a level of how do I work around those gaps? How do I create planning assumptions that enable me to move forward and not paralyze me with indecision? And I think that level of understanding, any company would be, thrilled to have somebody just outline it that way and see those things. And then that's where you can drive your questions. Some folks won't give you the answers and say, I just want to see you think through this thing. I certainly have had people kind of lock up and go, I don't know how to move through this. And then you give them pause and say, okay, let's regroup, collect yourself, and let's start with this. And maybe the interviewer will give you a, kind of an Easter egg to get started.
Man, I tell you, you students are so lucky to have these guys on the call with you, preparing you for case study interviews, because I personally am not giving students half of this information when I'm trying to prepare them for a case study interview. So I'm just gonna say from now on, here's the video, like watch this, because this is all you need to know in order to be successful. This is just great information. I'm gonna switch gears a little bit, and I'm gonna throw this question out to RJ and see if we can pull out some strengths that employers are looking for from a potential employee when they're doing a case study interview. Like, are there certain things that students can bring to the table when they're doing a case study interview that stands out more than other things?
So building actually on what Mike just said, that process and structure, if you can learn that, and having that structure, go back to my management consulting days. Once you kind of learn the management consulting way, any problem you're given, it's like, well, I've got this framework which I approach. And the same thing is with case studies. I like the framework, Mike, that you just threw out there. Find the one that works for you to help organize, synthesize the information. That person that is really structured in their thinking, I then have confidence that's like, okay, they may not have seen the scenario before, but whatever scenario I'm going to put in front of them, I know they're not just going to go, as Heather was saying, they're not just going to jump to that solution. They're not just going to, go too far in that one direction. They're going to think through structure and process. And it's easy, I'd say, not to make a generalization, it's easy at a college level to say, okay, I can generally go with my first gut in a class or a test or something like that. But when the problems get bigger and more complex, you have to have that process because there's suddenly moves from 10 moving pieces to 100 moving pieces to 1,000 moving pieces, and you've got to have that framework to support that growth. And that's really the strength that I'm looking for. I'm looking for that person that says, okay, I can see where this is going to grow. And they may not have all the answers, not supposed to, especially at the stage coming right out of college. But it's okay. They're logical thinking. We can teach them the rest.
I had to unmute myself. Awesome. Thank you, RJ. Heather or Mike, are we good? Anything you wanted to add to that?
There's certainly sorry, Heather, go ahead.
No, go for it.
I just wanted to put people at ease, the students at ease, because, there was an expectation in terms of, your number of years in the business, and, how when we were actually pulling people from McKinsey and bringing them into JP Morgan, there was a level of understanding that, hey, you really, have to have had this thought through and practiced, and, have your own personal style of problem solving. If we're bringing folks as interns or new hires, the level of questioning would be, slightly modified and expectations lowered. And also, I wanted to stress this to everybody. When someone you're interviewing for the job, they're also, on display. So that company, you have to see yourself as a cultural fit. And if they're treating you right and encouraging you to be your best self, there's a lot to be said for that. So like I mentioned earlier, when you're having an interview and it maybe had a misstep, and the interviewer stops you and say, hey, let's rethink this, let's think through it together, and really demonstrate a level of commitment to see you thrive and do well during these interviews. Certainly that was my intent. I never started an interview process with, I'm just gonna, crush this person. I want to see them succeed and do well. And there's a level of pride when you're the the part of that solution, and shaping that young employee. I think that's a lot of joy of leadership. So find the leaders that are going to make you better, improve your understanding of things, and mentor you well. So they also have a lot to prove to you. So if you ever get nervous, think about it that way.
Yeah, that's actually a really good point, because I think and Jeffrey, Jeff said this at the top, like, you're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you. So I think you also want to make sure, like, you have a sense, and you're earlier in your career, but, what do you stand for from a values perspective? What are you looking for in a company? Because you may want to ask the company, the people that are interviewing from there, like, what do they stand for? What's the culture like? Because that will give you a sense too for, like, will you fit in there? Will you like it there? Will you thrive, as Mike said? I think that's really important, in terms of sort of and granted, it's a little bit different than the case study part of it, but I think it's all part of that experience as you're going through those interviews. And I think that they appreciate that you're being thoughtful about that.
I think that
One thing
go ahead.
One thing I just add on, Mike, is it was not uncommon. We would get done with case interviews, we'd be debriefing, and somebody would be like, "Oh, this person was so close," and you could just see the interviewer just wanting to reach across the table and help and like give that one piece of missing information. So don't see the interviewer at odds with you. They do want to see you succeed, and sometimes it's like they know, like, you just maybe didn't get something there. So even if you didn't get it perfect, doesn't necessarily say, like, oh, you're not gonna get the job. Like, that's it's more open-ended than that. And I do think, especially in later stage interviews, the interviewer is there advocating for you because they want to see you succeed.
The one thing I was going to say, it's hard for students to understand that it's a two-way street, that you're kind of interviewing each other. A lot of times they only see it one way, and they don't necessarily see it as the interviewer helping them versus we often talk about how, look, they're talking to you because they want to make sure you're the right person for the job and that you'll fit into the culture of the organization. So it's more of a conversation more than it is a formalized memorization of how you're going to answer those questions. So I appreciate the fact that you're talking about how the interviewer is invested in the success of the interviewee. And I think that's important for students to understand, is that they're not out to get you. They're just trying to make sure, you're just trying to make sure that you're getting the best person for the job that you have advertised right now. So, I think that's important for students to understand. The last question that I want to ask you, the panel, is, and this kind of goes along with, Heather, you definitely mentioned it in something that you said, and RJ, you touched upon it as well. So I've had students who have come into me in the past and they said, I've gone through 3 different interviews, and the first interview went really well and the person was really nice. The second interview, this person, for whatever reason, just didn't like me. We just didn't get along. They just, every answer I gave them, they just looked at me like I was talking a foreign language. And then the last interview, the person was fine. So it's like, well, are they doing that on purpose? Are they trying to make you feel uncomfortable just to see how you would handle that situation? So Heather, I'm curious, in the interview, and you said you make it tough for them because you want to see how they handle that. Is that, so you purposely do that for that purpose?
I mean, I think we'll throw like a curveball in there. We're not trying to make them feel like literally cripple somebody, but just, I'm in customer facing, roles. There's a lot of them. We work and inevitably you're going to deal with a really challenging customer. So you need to be able to handle that. And so there's a lot of, that sort of empathy that you need to make sure that you start to internalize. So, oftentimes you can sort of ease or I'll say take the pressure out by, again, asking questions. It's about sort of that, because you don't want to react to the person interviewing. You want to act and answer questions the way that you normally would when maybe you're not getting so anxious about something. And I think the best way to do that is, again, to maybe ask a couple of additional questions and just get really curious about sort of maybe the line of questioning they're going down as part of it to, I guess, take the pressure out, so to speak. So I think that there's and I've seen it done a number of ways where the person that I'm interviewing, they can almost start to feel themselves getting like anxious about sort of where it's going, and they'll stop for a second and just take a moment and take a couple of breaths and then answer something from there. So I think there's a couple of different ways to do it. A, take a moment, take a breath, or B, maybe get curious about where the interviewer might be going if you don't understand the question, or if you don't sort of understand the angle that they're trying to process. So those are probably 2 suggestions that I'd have.
So Heather, I love it when you come on, not just for the answers that you're giving, but I also love your background as well. It's so relaxing to see that.
Very calming.
It's very calming. It makes me want to be there right now. So if somebody has to step back and take a breath and refocus, do you then look differently on them? Are you saying, oh, well, they're not prepared?
No, I don't. I mean, and usually I think I actually have been in interviews where I've asked some really, really hard questions, sort of this scenario, but just more of like something that they would never have thought of. And when they actually take a moment to really think through that and not sort of react or, oh my gosh, I have no idea, like, and a really long pause, like I'm talking, even though it's probably only 20 seconds, it can actually feel like 10 minutes basically. But I appreciate that they're literally trying to think through, okay, I'm putting myself in this situation, not what would she want to know the answer for, but like, how would maybe the customer in this situation need me to approach this situation? So, so I personally I actually respect when they do something like that.
So that's so important to hear, because we get that question all the time. What if I make a mistake, or what if I mess up, or what if I have to start over? all right, am I done? My chance is over. You know, a lot of students ask that question. So it's refreshing to hear that you don't mind if the student has to do that in an
No.
interview.
No, and I think we do a lot of, and Mike touched a little bit on this, hiring people who have a great deal of experience in an industry for a technology, but then we also hire earlier in career because we want people who are maybe thinking a little bit differently and aren't coming in with some preconceived notions or sort of a set way of doing things. So I think that there's a really important balance and value that, everybody on this phone brings to the table. And I think that, that's something that you need to internalize and understand. So that was something else I just wanted to mention from earlier.
Excellent, thank you. I didn't know, Mike or RJ, if you had anything to add on to that before we open it up to students.
Yeah, I would love to add on to that. The the market right now is really looking for people with the skill sets that are coming out of the high school. Information management, data analytics, that level of understanding things that are really ubiquitous across all the financial industry sectors. So you're really, there is a market out there that needs folks like you. So when I mentioned, the company is also very interested in finding the right people, and therefore giving people, a second chance of, okay, the case study, you didn't quite get it, but now I would pivot back to a resume oriented one and said, let's look back at one of your highlights of your resume. Now something that you're very familiar with, tell me about that process, use that as the case study. So I've done that where I've completely gone off script and said, okay, let's turn the case study on something that you're very comfortable with, and then get on the whiteboard and teach it to me, and let them really show off, so that skill set from a pedagogy approach of, how good can they stand there and instruct. That does show a level of understanding, and that's not meant to freak people out. It's meant to say, the companies are looking for your skill set, and the right one will open its door.
Man, I want my next interview to be with you for sure. Go
the
ahead,
other thing I'd
RJ.
add onto it is and just don't forget that it's just another human sitting across the table from you at the end of the day. So we've all been there. We've all been on both sides of the table. We're all constantly going through this process. So what Heather said is accurate. Take a second, because that shows me that, okay, you're going to collect yourself in a situation that you don't know. Once again, going back to that structure on the case, it's like how you're going to be thrown into situations on a regular basis that you just don't know what to do. Are you going to be the person that kind of fumbles through that, or are you going to step back and collect yourself and figure out where you go? So yeah, we're all human. We've all been there. So we know, and we also know it's stressful, and we all get stressed out when we're doing these interviews too, because we're it's this thing that you want. You're trying to show off your best. You're like, oh, I made this one mistake. Now it's all ruined. And reality is it's not, because we're all human. So it's okay.
And that actually, that sort of ability to fail fast is really important too. Not that we want everybody like failing a lot, but you're never going to get to sort of the innovative solutions unless you're trying a bunch of things in order to find sort of the better one or the best one. So again, it is that ability to, think in the moment, but not necessarily always have to be right, because you're actually going to be wrong more often than you're right. And so how do you then get through that? And it is a bit of, checking for, as I mentioned at the top, sort of learning and resiliency. So those are two really important things to make sure sort of you internalize.
Love that. Love that. Great answers. Thank you very much for answering my questions. I think you all did a stellar job, so kudos to you. And now we got 20 solid minutes of throwing it out to you students for any questions that you have for our panelists. So all you have to do is unmute yourself. I don't think there's a hand raising in Zoom. But go ahead. If anybody has a question, the floor is yours. Oh, yeah, there is hand raising. Thank you, Mike. So
I'm there for you, Jeff.
we can do it democratically, or we can just throw the floor open to anyone who has a question. Rohan, go ahead, sir.
Yeah, just first wanted to say like thank you so much for like this panel. Like it's really like informative. Like really appreciate it. Like had some really good points that I noted down. I had like one question, like so basically like aside from like asking like clarifying questions and like you know a step like taking a step back and thinking through like for like answers when like things get complicated, is there like anything we can like as people who interview who do the interviews do like to you know like stand out as compared to like who else is like interviewing like when it comes to like tackling cases?
Well, I'll start if you don't mind. So Rohan, I always respect somebody that's doing their homework. So, you know, perhaps they contacted a few others, you know, that have gone through the interview process. And, you know, at some point you want to keep it private, but you also want to find somebody that's not gonna stop researching. When I was in the Air Force, I got in trouble all the time because they're like, well, how did you get this information? Well, I called the CIA and I called NSA and I called these folks that were 8 echelons above where I was because I wanted to hear what their opinion was. So if I have an interviewer that's looking into, you know, how to best understand my company, what our culture is about, they did all their research, they asked a bunch of questions, they've built this kind of understanding, and then they're presenting that back to me. I'm going to be really impressed, and then I'm going to throw them a curveball they didn't expect and see how they handle it. So, but that person gets high points just by being as aggressive as possible, studying, asking questions, you know, trying to work the system.
Thank you so much.
I just want to share one anecdotal story on that. So I was doing an interview for Deloitte at school, and we asked an open-ended question of tell me about a company that you think is innovative. And we're sitting there, Deloitte, doing the interview, and the person then throws out a direct competitor name, like not even confusing, like a direct competitor name as like a highly innovative company. And I was like, okay, so how can you salvage this? So do your research and kind of think through like the industry dynamics on there. I say it as like a funny aside, but I was just like, okay, I can't wait to see how you kind of come out of this one.
Yeah, I would agree with that's probably the one thing that I think really does stand out is when somebody comes in, does the research, and actually comes in with an opinion, because oftentimes I'll ask, you know, for some of the people I'm interviewing, you know, what is our differentiator versus our competitors? And, you know, and how would you propose that we position ourselves versus them so that we can, and sort of comes in with a point of view around that. Good question.
We have so many people on this call, I can't even tell you guys. Dan.
So I was just going to follow up on that because I think it's an interesting point, is that opinions, bringing your opinions are good, is what I feel like I'm hearing. Obviously, following up on Mike, you want them to be researched opinions with maybe something behind them, but you are all three of you saying it's good to inject those opinions into the process?
For me personally, I think a point of view, so a very researched point of view about in this scenario that I'm giving you, sort of what is our value prop vis-a-vis some of our competitors, and where do you think our, let's say, our growth opportunities are? Yes, I am looking for you to come in with an educated point of view.
I just say on a, like, being well read in what's going on in the world, especially related to the industry, that will help you have an informed point of view, specifically for where you're going to interview. I know a personal thing I didn't do well enough in my elements of my career was doing enough research, to Heather's point, on the company that I was interviewing with, and it shows if you get asked a question and they want you to build on something that's specific to the company that you're interviewing with. And if you just haven't done that half an hour plus of good hard research and studying about the company, it does show. But I try to always at least, you know, read white papers, read any information that's like new thinking related to the job that you're going into, because that just gives you that informed point of view, and that background to fall on. Like when I made a move into banking, I never worked in banking before. I worked in healthcare for years. I did a lot of research on what was the trends in banking, and just I had that as a reference I could go back to and explain that, like, okay, my knowledge is limited, but I've done my homework, and that helps.
And for me, you know, in terms of that approach is really what critical thinking is all about. It's having an understanding of how things are happening in the marketplace, in that industry, and able to pivot off those other ideas. So you're going to have to be able to demonstrate that to truly be a critical thinker. Otherwise, you'll be afraid to ask questions, and we can't have that.
Samuel, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much. And hey, Dad.
Hey, Sam. Speaking of planting questions.
I didn't even pick up on that, of course.
Oh my God, Jeff.
You planted your son.
I was wondering if he was on here to haze you or something. I was hoping so.
I go here. I am a senior at Syracuse, and I'm minor in the high school. So I guess the biggest question, as someone, especially like me, going through the job, what is the specific mindset, and how do you want to attack the interviews and be aggressive and really go into that? Like, where should the psyche be?
I'll answer that. So here's something that I've shared before is interviews are big question marks, you know, so you have to go in with every interview is a practice until it turns out not to be. So you're going to learn from this interview, and what you learn from this interview, you're going to be so much better prepared for the next interview, especially if it's RJ's competitor. All of a sudden, you're now broadening out your experience level to really become, a better candidate for the next job. If it so happens that the skill set you bring into that interview that you think is practice, and it turns out to be real, that's jackpot. All of a sudden, it's worked out to your favor. So, I think the stress of, this is the company I have to work for. I just think that mindset can be a little bit debilitating and can create more of the anxiety. I want someone to be comfortable. I want that person to be smooth and articulate. And I want, when I'm hiring them, and to see somebody that's relaxed, they've done their homework, they're confident, and they're swinging at the fence. If they, and they have a feeling like, hey, you want me to work for you. And that's the approach that I think is a healthy one. Thank you, Sam, for that outstanding question.
That is one thing I'll just add in sort of building on that is getting feedback at the end before you leave the room. Ask the people interviewing, like, can you recommend me, or, get a little bit of feedback from them. Because I think, to Mike's point, it's all about learning. And so if you can get that learning in the moment, it's golden. And it also gives you the opportunity, if they say, hey, you did great, except I didn't see this. It also gives you the opportunity to address any of those objections that the interviewers may be bringing up. So that's just something to think about as you finish up these interviews, is asking, can you recommend me? Any feedback that you have for me?
From a psyche perspective, I like to think through on, showing up genuinely, being confident, but then also not being arrogant, because that's equally as turn off. And you've got to have an ounce of being humble in there too. You're not going to know everything that's thrown there. So be confident, but arrogance is don't.
So one of the things that Christopher put in the chat is a book that he recommended called Case Interview Secrets. And I know this is a book that he has in his office. He actually has a couple copies that he gives to students who are preparing for case study interviews. And one of the questions asked in the chat was, does anybody have any other resources that you could share with students to help them prepare for case study interviews going forward?
There's another book called Case in Point, isn't there? Is it written by the same? I'm like looking it up right now. It's written by no, that's Case in Point's another one I've read.
Case in Point?
Yep.
Oh, Christopher's got Case in Point too.
Yeah, I have 2 copies of that in my office too. If any students are on campus this semester and would like to borrow a copy of either of those books, just let me know. First come, first serve. I'm in on Tuesdays and Thursdays.
Yeah.
Any special process they have to go through, Christopher, to take one of those books?
Get a job. Get an internship, get a job.
All right, the floor is open. Any students want to ask a question or put it in the chat? We're happy to answer your questions. Any comments? Asima.
Hi.
Hi. We missed
so
you today in our meeting.
Yeah, I'm sorry about that.
Go ahead.
So I wanted to know if suppose a particular case study is talking about a particular technology that you don't know about or haven't had the opportunity to work on. So how are we supposed to address those situations?
You know, I think there's some baseline understandings, and in our case studies, we've done code reviews, which is kind of a different intensity altogether. But for a case study, it should be attainable by, you know, folks that the quality of folks that you're interviewing. So, you know, if something is that outrageous, I think you might have a mismatch right up front. And in that respect, it's better to just terminate the interview early than to say, hey, we're just not even on the same, you know, on the same sheet of music. You know, that being said, attainability on the interviewer's part, because no one wants to have somebody walk in cold. We've done, you know, in terms of our process, I didn't really mention that, but we would have pre-screenings even by a third-party organization, you know, so that interviewee would have, you know, at least probably 4 pre-screenings and a phone call before they got even close to a case. So I would expect if both sides have done their homework, there's a level of conversation that can be had.
So that's a good point, Mike, you made. So would you say in the process of interviewing, the case study typically is towards the end?
Absolutely. And then I would probably, if it's an initial interview, or I might even ask, you know, will there be a case study at this next level? That might be, you know, too much of an assumption, and you might put ideas in people's heads, which could be problematic. But you know, it does show a level of confidence that, you know, your critical thinking skills, and I believe that's what the iSchool is invested in you academically, you know, has a chance to shine when you have those kind of opportunities in front of you to show how you think through problems.
And to help Asima, those interviews that you had before the case study, you would have weeded out the fact that maybe you didn't know a technology that they were looking for. So you're not going to be, I guess the point is you're not going to be surprised in the case study on something that you haven't even talked about in any of the other interviews.
Yeah, so my case studies were very general and attainable, you know, to anybody that's lived in, you know, a certain era. It would never be about a certain technology, like, you know, here's a case study about Kubernetes, you know, unless there was something up front that was explicitly stated in their job description and in their resume, and then that all of a sudden, I think that moves beyond a case study, and that's more of a code review or a project review, which quite frankly, we're getting into more and more. You know, there's a level of, you know, you know, RJ, I like when you said we're all human. Well, there are bots going through resumes these days, and those bots say, well, this person, you know, this resume goes, this one stays, and I'm afraid that you know, we've had some problems with resumes having all the right buzzwords, but not the substance and the depth, and that comes through in the interview. So we are starting, you know, case study, and then you go code review, project review. That's another different level. That's where you get the good cop, bad cop. You got the crusty CTO come in and say, I've had a bad day, I'm back-to-back meetings, and I'm gonna take it out on you. And if you survive that one, all the better. If you don't, it was just practice.
Thank you. That was really helpful.
So Heather, I noticed that you were shaking your head when we were talking about the types of case studies that you give. Are they more general in nature, not necessarily technology based? Would you agree with that?
We do have groups that give the code-based case study interviews, but I think to Mike's point, usually we've done pre-screening on the technology at that point. So I don't think you'd ever get into that situation and be like, can you go up to the board and, you know, address this in a technology that you have no idea about? Usually you've caught that in some of the either pre-screening or an initial interview, if you've gotten to that point.
Excellent. So we're getting late into our session. The time flies by. So I know that everyone's going, what? It's almost over already? So I was wondering if each of you wouldn't mind giving the students like one more like you know, lift off into the case study land, one little nugget that they can take with them to help them get through this process, because it's, as you know, and as you've been talking about for this last hour, it's not easy on both sides. So anything that you can say to students to kind of pump them up to get them through this process would be amazing. Say want to start? Or any last wishes or last bits of advice, I guess.
I think it was Mike or RJ, one of you said, you know, I mean, you have an amazing education, and the iSchool, like the education you've gotten has set you up for so many jobs need your skills right now. I'd say that's something that you should be very proud of. So, you know, if you don't find a job right off the bat, just know that there's literally a dearth of candidates out there with the kind of skills that you have. So I'd say, like, you guys you're in a really good position. And I think that that's something, you know, you should all be very proud of, and go find something that you're passionate about. So that would be my biggest thing. Go find something that you're passionate about.
When I worked at JP Morgan, I had four Syracuse University grads on my team. And then I had 2 interns that were going into their senior year. So when it came around Final Four, March Madness, we had a lot of support. So all I'm trying to say is Syracuse folks like to hire Syracuse grads. So you have a good network. So use it.
The thing I'll add on that is don't be intimidated by the interview process. Don't be intimidated by the case study. You can practice if you're feeling like, hey, I feel like my skills, my chops aren't really there for a case study. You can practice these things, and you can get a buddy and you can case study one another. So don't be too freaked out about it. And I do agree. Use the network. A number of people LinkedIn is always getting messages. So reach out, talk to your network, and there's always other opportunities. And you know, I see a lot of people that's like, well, I must get this management consulting job. I must get this XYZ job at whatever company. And it's like, you might, and sometimes the bot weeds you out in the process, and that's just life. But you can recover, and you'll end up where you need to be. So don't let it over stress you in the process.
Well, you guys are awesome. I want to thank you once again for sharing your insights and your experience and your expertise with our students. We truly appreciate it. Thank you for taking the time to come on. We would love to have you again at a later time to do something like this again. That would be amazing. Hopefully, we'll be able to do a similar type of format. Maybe we could do it in person, which would be pretty cool, so people could actually see you, and maybe we can hand a microphone to somebody to ask a question. Christopher, I wanted to give you an opportunity if you wanted to say any last parting words to our panelists or to the students.
I wanted to just show my appreciation, hearing from folks in the trenches who have done this and who have such a strong connection with the iSchool, whether you're an alum or whether you work with us on a different level. This was so fantastic for our students tonight, and especially for Jeff, myself, and Adrian. We really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I want to thank the students also for attending. We know it's late, it's Thursday. It's late in the semester, so the fact that you're here and listening to us and taking all this information in, we truly appreciate it. So we hope that this was valuable for you and that you now have a much better understanding of what a case study interview is and what the process is to go through a case study. So thank you so much for attending and for participating. For those of you that asked questions, they were amazing. We appreciate that. And once again, thank you, panelists. We appreciate your time.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, I volunteer to interview Jeff in a mock case study. See if I can
He has an IM degree, Mike. I mean, he'd be a good
bring the box of tissues, Jeff.
I would clean up on that interview. You would be
You gotta
so
rub your
impressed.
nose and eyes.
All right, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you very much.
Good night. Thank you.